And last but not least, MetroStar Systems, who are sponsoring this panel, our keynote. Let me introduce Jason Stoner.
Hi, everybody. We're a local company as well, digital agency. Great benefits, great culture. We're hiring, but at the same time, it takes a community. And the more people we have in companies all over the world, the more great work we're going to be able to do. And that's really why we're here today. You know, when we look at information architecture for good, it's hard to imagine DC WIA Day not talking about doing something around civic design. Many people here in the room work for the federal government some way or another, whether you're in the government, whether you're a contractor working there. And this is an exciting time to be working with the government. There's so much change going on to help make things better. That's why everybody's in the room today. Our work helps over 320 million Americans, whether it's filing tax returns, getting information, getting benefits, getting assistance from the VA. The list goes on and on. These are important challenges that we face. We hear about it in the news. So the work that we do, it's bigger than just a website. It's bigger than pretty pictures. It's solving real challenges that help people. And we've made a lot of progress over the years, but we haven't done it alone. We have assistance from great groups within the government, 18F and US Digital Services. It's helping to build that shared vocabulary. So now all the language that we're talking about is understood within the government. So we're connecting those dots to help make it easier to help the people, the citizens that we really need. We're assisting with accessibility, usability, plain language standards, improving digital sites, tools, applications. Very important things once again. In many ways, we're the vanguard for digital democracy. There's so much more that we can do, and civic design is more important than ever. Today's panel brings together innovators, change agents, those that have been on the front lines of digital democracy and civic design. I'll let the moderator introduce the panelists, but it's my pleasure to introduce Whitney Quesenbery. There's a couple things you should know about Whitney. She's quite an innovator and a pioneer in the field. There's a lot of tools, resources that we take for granted every day that she's been at the forefront of creating and pioneering for us. She's the co-founder and co-director for the Center of Civic Design, along with a friend of World IA Day DC, Dana Chisnell. She helped author the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, including the first usability requirements for voting systems. I don't know if anybody was in the card sorting discussion with the hanging chads. They'd have to work pretty hard to make something that bad. Served on the Accessory Board's Advisory Committee, updating Section 508. Thank you for that. That's something we deal with every day, and it's really important. Is author of numerous books and articles on user experience, as well as semi-annual publications on voting and elections. Teaches user experience research at Rutgers University. Serves on the advisory board for the Center of Technology and Civic Life, Participatory Budgeting Project, and Vote.org. She has a thriving UX consultancy, WQ Usability. The Accessibility Director of World IA Day 2016, 17, and 18 Global Team. That's quite a list. Please join me in welcoming Whitney Quesenbery and the Civic Design panelists.
And just before we hand it over to the panel, if you have open seats next to you, can you raise your hand? We have half a dozen people in back that could use a seat. Okay, and please be obliging, let people move in, and thank you guys, and turn it over to the panel.
So that was amazingly embarrassing. I think largely because there's absolutely no change that doesn't come at some kind of price or with some kind of struggle. And so it's easy to look back and say, wow, this thing happened. But when you're in the middle of it, it feels like it will never happen. I think everybody on this panel has credentials that are just as interesting and just as amazing. And so my job is to move to them as fast as we can. But I wanted to say something about civic design. I've been a long time in this business, and when new words come along, they tend to get treated as though they're replacing everything that came before it. And I think of this as much more as a yes and, because all the skills, whatever skills you bring, whether you're an MLS or a graphics designer or an IA or a UX designer or a UXD, I mean, whatever you are, those skills are all part of it. You don't leave those behind. It's funny to be doing this panel in a room full of people who work in and around government, because I think you probably get as much of it as any audience will ever get it, because you live a lot of this day to day. So in the spirit of yes and, what we want to do is sort of introduce to you some of the concepts about what we think civic design is, and how the shift in the mindset that lets you go from, oh, I just draw wireframes, to, no, I have a much bigger goal, and no matter how, they say no small parts, only small actors. No, the other way around, right? Right? No small actors, only small parts. Is that no matter what your job on something is, that you could be part of building towards something that's bigger and more inspiring and more innovative, no matter what that is. And of course, my phone is going out. So because this is DC, we're going to be talking a lot about the federal government, but it's not just that, and it's not even just city and state governments, although there are digital innovation services popping up in cities and states across the country. It's really amazing now that when we go into a new state, we're often greeted by, and here's our CDT, right? Here's our group. But it's also cropping up in organizations that that are working from the outside, that are thinking about how we create citizens who are more able to interact with government, how we create citizens who have more agency in their interaction, and in effect begin to demand more of all of ourselves, no matter what our role is. So let me just turn to the panel. There we go. And I'm going to do this in the order they are on the screen, because that way I won't go crazy. Andrew Lovett-Barron is now a fellow at New Media, but was one of the first product designers at the U.S. Digital Service at the DoD, and is doing some really interesting explorations about how nonprofits work and how the thinking that goes into emergency response can be, used in our work. Christine is a graphic designer and a creative director. She was the creative manager at HHS Digital Communications and reimagined HHS.gov. And I think is passionate about the idea that it's more than just interaction, it's brand as well. Courtney is the director of technology at Color for Change right now, was formerly USDS at the VA. And although she keeps telling us that she's out of the business now, it doesn't really seem to be. You never get to leave. Marcy Jacobs is leading the USDS team at the VA, and was the practice lead at USDS in her last posting. And is, as a leader of the team, is really responsible for bringing all those pieces together to make sure that what happens at the end isn't a great IA, but is a great experience. And Suzanne, last but not least, is a UX generalist. I think, did you and Dana come up with that title together?
I have no idea.
Yeah. She also, yeah, of course you did. Of course you did. Also working at the VA, and probably is the closest to an IA because her passion was bringing order from chaos. So that sounds an awful lot like IA to me in its own way. I want to start by asking everybody, starting at the far end, to just talk about what their light bulb moment was. I mean, what made them sort of say, wait, I'm doing something bigger? And I'll tell you mine to sort of kick them off so they can all think about what they're going to say here. In 2002, end of 2002, I was sitting on the stage at NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, getting ready to give a little talk about, usability of ballots, when two of the speakers before me, one of them on the stage, one of them in the audience, started screaming at each other. I don't mean arguing, I mean shrieking at each other at the top of their lungs. One saying that what was really important was security, that we had to make sure we weren't using black lives matter, and the other one saying what was really important was that everybody, including people with disabilities, could vote independently and privately. We were all like tipping the table up and getting the sandbags out, sort of wondering what was going to happen. But for me, that was a moment when I realized that you don't get to choose. right? That both of those are equally important, and you don't get to throw some people under the bus to make it better for other people. That it's really about finding your way through these complex, contradictory environments, these wicked problems, to have a solution that actually works for the people, for the institutions, for the concept of democracy in general. So I will now turn it down and let's let them wrap down the aisle, down the row.
All right. I have a not terribly similar, but not dissimilar example. But before working for the USDS, I did UX for higher ed, which has a very similar scenario. I was a UX team of 1 alongside 50 developers, no product managers or project managers or vision, etc. So it was a very lonely existence, and I was really inching my way towards trying to make a lot of things better. And then I went to a conference presentation. I can't remember exactly who it was, but someone from the GDS, the British version of the USDS. It was around 2012. USDS didn't exist yet. And I had a viscerally positive reaction to it. I didn't know that this world existed. And I thought to myself, like, this is where I need to be, that even if I'm inching forward, that I would be able to do it at a much larger scale and be able to work with really smart people and have all that labor I was putting into my work actually result in things that I felt proud of. So that's how I landed here.
I've been going back and forth on my answer to this, but probably the big one was, so prior to USDS, I was a team lead at IDEO in the software design practice, and we did a bunch of work with Planned Parenthood. And we were building some software for the patient-facing experience for people coming into the clinics. And we're trying to figure out like why we couldn't get stuff connected to the enormous monolithic health record systems. And so it was like, well, why not, shift them around or try to build something. And then I discovered meaningful use and where sort of design, software development, and policy intersect and create bonfires, frankly. So I think probably my experience with Planned Parenthood, both positive and negative, in trying to implement software there and like create things, led me to USDS and this sort of question of civic design, civic tech.
There it is.
You have your own
I
microphone?
do. I have my own. So when I kind of think about this, it's interesting because I think I was never really supposed to be a designer. I'm a front-end developer by trade that kind of ended up being a back-end developer. And I worked at iStrategy Labs, and we worked on a project where we were working with a nonprofit that was trying to get low-cost internet in low-income households. They were starting here in DC, but they wanted to expand around the country. And one of the things that kept coming up is, how do we build this? As a company that did like Fortune 500, Nickelodeon, everything was like so brand focused generally. But the question kind of started coming up, how do we design something for people that have low literacy around computers, because we're trying to help them get access to internet? Like, they aren't used to patterns, typical UI patterns. These people aren't used to even interacting with the computer. Internet Explorer is probably the thing that they're interacting with most in libraries. And that I kind of got sucked into that problem and started heavily working with our design team. And then it was kind of, I guess, uphill from there, not downhill, uphill. And then, left and started working in politics on the political UX and then technical side, and wanted to just have a larger impact. Was super happy trying to get people to be part of the process, but wanted to think about how does the process work for the people. And that's what brought me to USDS.
Cool, I didn't know that. This is all USDS family. So I'm Marcy, and I've been with USDS for 2 years. And before that, I ran a design and user experience practice at a large government consulting firm. So I've always done a little bit of civic tech around the edges, but running a practice was a lot of different roles. The project that I think was really the tipping point for me was working for the FBI on a system that supports command post operations. And it can be used for anything from, it was used for the Boston Marathon bombing, but it can be used for kidnapping in an area where the local police department is overwhelmed and they need help from the Bureau. So it was designed by a lot of agents who were subject matter experts who thought about how a case on paper should move. Command post operations are very not typical. There's lots of crazy energy. And what was fascinating was actually starting to see where these problems were and be in these high stress situations and do a very different type of user research than I'd ever done before and a different type of testing than I'd ever done before, because it's really hard to simulate that type of chaos. So we worked on some changes. Kayanda, actually, who presented before me, was on my team. We worked on some changes to the system, and when I heard from one of the child abduction rapid deployment people, the CARD team, the people who get sent out when there's a kidnapping, saying that the changes that we had made to the system would make it easier for him to find a child faster, that was when it was like the tipping point of the impact that we can have through design and through research. It's something that I just couldn't ever walk away from.
That's a really good moment. That's a big moment. Okay. So in my time with HHS, I had the privilege of being part of the initial team working on healthcare.gov. And in understanding who the primary users were, secondary users, were taking a look at all this information and faced with, how do we get people to be comfortable enough to give their personal information, give their health information, information around their families, et cetera, to be able to get covered? And faced with this, trying to take a look, it really boiled down to trust. And although this might be something that you're thinking, well, isn't that inherent? But no, it should be. But when you're working on it, it's building it in every single interaction. So not only giving folks what they're looking for and explaining things that seem to be complex, but keeping things really simple and keeping things so that that value is there, that people could see that interaction. Whereas if I do this, I understand and expect that I'm going to get Y. And this really building trust, not only to understand what this thing was that was so complex with regards to the Affordable Care Act, but then also with regards to the process. So trust became an underlying principle for that project, and trust became the approach in everything that I do thereon.
Cool. So in preparing for this panel, we actually spent a lot of time kind of telling each other stories, but this is the IA Institute, and it was formed out of what we call DTDT, or defining the damn thing. And we thought, we actually tried to come up with a definition, and we actually failed on it, because we think it's really either too many words to make a crisp definition, but it's really about how we expand what we do. And we came up with, here we go, with five words that we thought really exemplified what makes something civic design as opposed to just the tasks that we're doing. One was the scale, the level and the kinds of responsibilities you have, the diversity of both the audience and the teams you're working with, the different roles we have to interact with when you really begin to think at a high level, and Christine's already introduced trust. We're going to go back down the line a little bit. We've sort of assigned everybody one word to unpack a bit, and then we're going to just break into conversation, because I know by the time we get to about the third person, someone's going to be sitting there saying, yes, I have something to add, and then we'll let everybody jump in and add things there. So Christine, why don't you start us off with the question of scale? Because you both have addressed this a little bit, but...
So with regards to scale, I can think of a few projects where this comes into play, but as you're thinking about these projects or something that you're working on, scale goes beyond your primary and secondary users. You have to think about the larger group, the larger community, how that's going to affect the larger process, the larger journey, the bigger task that's at hand. And, I see this in a number of projects where scale is not just in terms of the larger task, but with that comes also a larger audience. And you're thinking about a variance within that audience and that scale and those things and folks to take in consideration and the diversity there as well. I'm thinking about a project that we just did with reimagining of HHS, and there you have a number of different primary users that were part of this, and it's something that in terms of scale is actually enterprise site. So not only thinking about reimagining this site to be simpler, easier, clearer to use, but also in terms of something that's enterprise, something that's site-wide, and something that's going to work for the offices, staff divisions, topic sites. This is big. and trying to incorporate all of that into a design. And now thinking about scale from a design perspective, from a solution perspective, it has to be something that's flexible, something perhaps that is component-based, modular, something that can scale and evolve over time as well. So I'm just bringing in a few of these concepts because I see them in a lot of these projects that we're doing to think, what's the task at hand? What do we need to do? How that's going to expand out and scale into the bigger, to solve that bigger process and to help that become a better benefit on a whole.
Responsibility. So when I think about responsibility, I think about it from a number of angles. One, as a taxpayer and as the kind of custodian of other taxpayers' money, working for the government, the VA has a kind of ridiculous budget for IT, $4.2 billion. That's a lot of good that we can do if we point that at the right things. So I think about that responsibility really married with the 22 million veterans and the 25 million family members of veterans that we are trying to support and serve. So one example of responsibility, there's a very complicated new law focusing on the appeals process. So an appeal happens when you get a claim decision and you don't like it, and you want to appeal that decision. Right now, that process is linear, phenomenally long. It's 5 years on a good, like the short end is 5 years. There are many cases that are up to 10 plus years. And the backlog is 470,000 cases. So a non-trivial kind of government scale problem. So this new legislation was introduced and goes into effect next February to try to reduce this volume of cases that need to be adjudicated. And it's really complicated. It's not just you go from a claim to a decision to appeal that decision to wait in line for a really long time. It's you go from a claim to a decision, and then you can take a lot of different paths, and some of those paths fork into other paths. So in a great concept, the VA was trying to pilot this new legislation to figure out some of the implementation questions and would people understand the choices that they were making. And they wrote a letter that they were going to send to 300,000 veterans, which sounds really big for a pilot. So they were going to send out this letter without testing it or anything like that to just see how people made their choices. We took a little bit of issue with that and stepped up and took some responsibility, even when we weren't asked, to do some vetting of this letter, which explained some of these paths, but not the implications of other choices. And what we learned through our testing, which I think we did in like 5 days, so it was super rapid because they wanted to get this letter out because the secretary was saying, don't wait, let's rush, because that's, you know, how things work. 66% of the people that we tested made an inadvertent wrong decision. They pulled themselves out of the line that they had been in for potentially 5-8 years to try a different path or to potentially cancel their appeal altogether, and had no idea that that was the decision that they were making. So we took that feedback just from user testing a piece of paper and completely changed the communication that was going out to users to try to mitigate some of these downstream inadvertent negative consequences. There will be many, many more rounds of design and iteration as this thing becomes more real. And we take a lot of responsibility for the 470,000 people who have been in line, who shouldn't be in line this long, and certainly we don't want them to make a choice that they don't understand. Have you missed the VA?
Oh, man, the VA. VA is the best.
It is.
Diversity. All right. So the way that I like try to frame diversity and the way that I think about it is that it's part of every single project. Like, you know, every agency has their codes about how diversity happens and how we hire and affinity groups and like all of these things, right? But every project that you touch, diversity is part of the conversation, and not just diversity. I think like we oftentimes forget the other side of that, which is inclusion. So thinking about some of the projects we worked on at the VA, one of which that I love to this day was the healthcare application, the online healthcare application. One of the things that we did when we like really looked through that is to try to think about how does people's identities play a role in how they fill out forms. So one of those identities being, is someone who is a veteran trans, right? So we interviewed some trans veterans and like had them look at how they fill out their healthcare application because it impacts how they get healthcare. This might also play a role in responsibility, to be quite honest. But at the end of it, we realized that like some of the data that was going in was resulting in them not receiving the right adjudication because there is like identity information with the Pentagon that does not match if you don't enter it in correctly from the VA. So that is like a thing, right? Like DOD will say, well, when you served, your gender or sex was male, but now it's female. I ask you the wrong question through the VA. We can't identify, you're denied, right? And so one of the things we actually also ended up doing was working with the LGBTQ affinity group at the VA to actually work on definitions that now span the VA around gender identity and sexual orientation, which now, because those are like larger policies, we can start to implement in other projects at the VA. That's one example. I feel like when I was there, I was like on a mission to do a lot of this stuff. But I think that we have to keep in mind and flag that like diversity plays a part in the projects, not necessarily. I think oftentimes we like to think of diversity right amongst us, but really it comes out of the projects at us, and we have to think about that when we're doing work. You have your own.
Okay, I'm doing roles. I was actually not super sure how to answer this because one of the things I identified or at least saw in government is that there are very sort of well-defined hierarchical structures that you encounter. And for quick context, I was at the DoD, the USDS team there. So like the gnarliest hierarchy of all the hierarchies that ever like hierarchically organized a bunch of people. But like the thing that I found really interesting about roles is they could serve as sort of like, they could serve as shortcuts for you to identify how to navigate an organization and ultimately get things done. Like when you're building software, when you're doing design, the actual creation of the tool is only a small part of it. Particularly in government, most of the work is often in and around, making sure the thing is socialized with lots of different people, making sure you get buy-in and also contribution and participation from all the different groups involved. How do you figure out what those groups are? What are the things that you just simply don't know, like the sort of Rumsfeld-style unknown unknowns? And what I found the sort of role side of civic design to be is surfacing as many of those unknown unknowns as possible. So looking at the hierarchy and then trying to surface or bubble up the networks that sort of lay underneath all of that. So like I did a bunch of work at US Transcom, which is the transportation command in the Air Force, but really it's all across all the different commands. And you had different groups within Transcom that were, they had very specific roles and responsibilities, and sometimes one would be doing something that sort of, stepped on the responsibility of the other group, and as a consequence, you would get contention, like a certain amount of infighting or even ignoring of information going back and forth. So the job that particular group was trying to do wasn't getting done effectively. But it would still get done. And when we were trying to figure out why it was still getting done, it was because there were these informal networks that were taking place behind the scenes across the different commands. Because everybody lived on base together, so everybody knew each other. And even if they were yelling at each other while they were in uniform in a boardroom trying to prioritize a set of tasks, they would then work it out afterwards while their kids were playing on off base. So identifying those kind of the things that are hidden and then finding ways to utilize that in ultimately delivering on the designs and the development that you're trying to do, for me, is one of the most significant and frankly hardest pieces of doing good civic design work.
Crazy. All right, trust. Trust is probably something we talk about in our office weekly, if not daily. It plays into a lot of the things that we do. Not just the projects that we pick, but our processes, that we're actually user-centered in our process, how we recruit those participants, and then how we are actually designing to solve complex problems. So the example I was going to use, I think, is probably another one of Courtney's favorite projects, which is a tool we just launched to help people upgrade their discharge status. I think it was Courtney's and someone else's idea, so kudos for that. But the scenario with this thing is that a lot of people don't get an honorable discharge, sometimes for legitimate reasons, but also for reasons like under decisions under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, sexual assault cases that were mishandled, and misdiagnosed PTSD. So there are these really unfortunate scenarios where people don't get the honorable discharge and then don't get benefits. So trying to figure out how to regain the trust of the people who we were trying to serve, doing that research was probably the hardest round of research we've ever done. Because not only is it already kind of a weird thing when we ask people to talk to us for an hour about their problems, they're always like, who are these weird people and why are they asking me these questions? But we knew we had to take that little bit of extra time up front to help gain their trust just to even have that conversation, because we really needed them to tell us their story, and these are very traumatic stories. But I have to say that once we kind of have a little routine that we do for our research, but part of that is helping them understand that we are trying to fix this problem, but we can't actually do it without them. Then we can kind of feel that click of tone, and they really open up once they understand that we're genuinely trying to do it and that we need their input. But anyway, so we were able to build this tool. It basically takes about 100 pages worth of guidance that exists and boils it down to a handful of questions that then provides some really sort of TurboTax style, I guess is what we call it, guidance around what form. There are many forms, there are many different paths to take, but really giving that customized experience for you and your questions, right? So the execution of that design, our use of plain language, all of these little tiny moments that happen throughout that entire project and our process, those are all the things that help us rebuild the trust that we had in fact lost because of how their cases were handled.
So I want to actually chime in, because although I've spent some time in the federal government as a contractor, I'm now working mostly with state governments and county governments, and it's a whole different level that happens. And one of the words that we talk about a lot is collaboration. And to illustrate what I mean, typically when the government changes something, it starts from legislation or regulation. The agency in charge kind of closes their doors, does whatever they're going to do, issues something, there's a comment period, and then it happens. And then at these few critical moments, the outside advocacy groups, who've often been the people who caused the law to be created in the first place, get to weigh in. And it's a really stupid process, right? Because it cuts out so much innovation and human capital and ideas and understanding the problem as you go along. And another thing that I haven't heard here yet is languages. In elections, languages are critically important. We do a lot of work in California where they support 13 languages statewide, 17 all total with state requirements. So there is nothing simple about even the smallest form. And we've been testing around a new style of voter registration that's about to launch April 1st, we hope. And while it's been tested in English, it wasn't tested in languages. And so we went out and we're working with monolingual or barely bilingual speakers of Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese, because those are the biggest single language groups in the state, and also because some of them have the lowest rates of voter registration among eligible voters. And there was a particular question we were really, really worried about. And we got to participant 40. And we were kind of doing the happy dance because we hadn't seen this problem crop up, and we'd seen it before and we weren't seeing it now, and it was a new prototype, and we were really kind of beginning to pat ourselves on the back that we had with us 2 of us from the Center for Civic Design, the 2 people working from the California digital team, the governor's office, CIO team, who were working inside the DMV. The translator for this session, the next session 41, was someone from one of the really powerful advocacy groups who's a native Spanish speaker, and we had someone from the Secretary of State's office who was also a Spanish speaker. And about 3 minutes into the session, it happened. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's a long and complicated story, but all of us kind of froze. And in fact, the guy's wife, who had just finished her session, was waiting for him, went, "Oh no, that's wrong." Right? And so we all sat there, and what was amazing about that was, first of all, that it did surface in our sessions, because had it not, we would not have been able to go back to the DOT, who's in charge of all of this, and say, this is really important. But more importantly, we had people from every single group responsible for creating this form present at the moment when it happened. So the advocacy, the person from Future of California Elections was able to go back out to her advocacy community and gather input. And one of the things we learned was that the biggest problem was the style of the translation, right? We all know government forms sound like, gargling marbles. And this one they'd worked hard to try to bring that down a little bit, but the way the question was worded didn't translate well. It just simply didn't translate. In one language, it was actually inaccurate. We actually got that fixed before we started. But it was leading people to answer a really critical question, a question that put them in jeopardy incorrectly. And had we not had all those stakeholders there together, had the language advocacy community and the immigrants' rights community and the Get Out the Vote community not insisted that this be tested in language, making it possible for us to be there, that moment wouldn't have happened. So a lot of, I think, what we do in civic design in general is we kind of create the moments, create the activities where the moments can happen, where something that we think is true is either proved true or false, but it's proved true or false in a way that everybody can see it and it galvanizes action. When we had the call with 27 people on the phone call from everybody in the state, they weren't giving up that they were going to change it, but I'd already been shown the prototypes of the sketches for the new screens, and they were letting the designers say, oh yes, we've already worked on that. So even though they haven't told us that they're going to make that change, I'm pretty sure they are. And I'm pretty sure they are because everybody was able to sort of testify to the fact that this really does happen. Think about how it expands behind Mr. 41, right, and what it means. So with that, I think that's hopefully a decent transition to the next thing we want to talk about. I'm just going to put our pictures up so that you can all keep names tied to people and tweet madly and all those things. But I want to come back down off the heights of the sort of goals that we are aiming at to talk about practices, right? How do we put all of this stuff into practice? And I had a great question queued up, but I've lost it, so I finally went dead. But so what are the things that we do that take, like you were talking about saying, no, we know how to do usability testing, and we could do it, and we did it in 5 days, and it was enough to not maybe answer the whole question? So could you talk about how you actually got that to happen? What, from the time you said, well, we need to test it, what happened?
I don't even know if they gave us a copy of the letter or if we somehow got a copy of the letter, but we did not feel good about what we saw. I think that example is just one example of stakeholders have lots of ideas, and as we all know, stakeholders are typically not the users of the things and never use the thing. Like, they don't use it before it deploys. Ask them to demo the product. It's a great, painful experience for them. But I've always relied on data and user testing as a way to push back on ideas. So right now we're dealing with the next shiny object, and we've got political appointees who have a great idea. But when we've actually shown that great idea to the people who want that thing, it's not what they're expecting. It's not going to do what they think it's going to do. And it's only data that is going to convince them that maybe there's an alternate approach. It might not convince them, but at least we've done our job to show, here's what happened when we showed this to 15, 20, 30 people. You can still make the decision you're going to make, but now you know the implications of that. I think going back to something that you said earlier about how these new policies come out, there's lots of advocacy groups talking about, we need to reduce the appeals backlog, or we need to solve whatever problem, and they come up with some idea without any real tie to how this idea will be implemented or a technological solution, and potentially they go so far as to start dictating how implementation should happen and really bringing the user into that conversation, whether or not that can actually affect policy, but certainly can affect how you deploy a new policy, brings more richness and more data to those conversations.
Courtney, you talked about air cover. Did you?
I did. And yeah, so when we were all kind of getting together, figuring out what we were going to talk about, I think one of the things I wanted to note now, kind of being outside of the government, is that I didn't want to come here and say like, oh, here's like all the great ways you can do this without really acknowledging that at USDS, we had a absorbent amount of air cover that most people working inside of the federal government just don't have, right? Like, we were a team created out of President Obama's like mind, and we, for all intents and purposes, had carte blanche to like go in and do things and say, hey, we want a meeting with the secretary. Hey, we have this great idea, you know, and get access to a lot of people, and we got a lot of leeway and a lot of things. So I think one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we really recognized and appreciated was that everyone doesn't have that same experience. And we can get up here and say like, oh, well, you know, we build trust this way and we do that. But I thought it would be inauthentic of us to like not acknowledge that of other people working in the government.
So how do you create air cover when you don't have it?
I mean, you guys probably know now.
Wait. We have to go back up. What is air cover?
So, oh yeah, air cover. When I say air cover, I mean that like we basically had a person in a higher position saying that yes, you have the ability to like implement whatever your idea is, or right. So for USDS, the headquarters of USDS sits inside of the executive office of the president. And there are other teams that are kind of deployed to agencies, but at the end of the day, we're like all part of this like one, it is a federated system, part of this one conglomerate. And so even though we were deployed out to the VA, we had direct access to the secretary of the VA, and we also, because of that relationship, they also knew that we were born out of this executive office of the president post, right? So like an example of that is like when we wanted to go in and fix the healthcare application at the VA, there was a guy that we talked to on the phone a bunch of times that was like, I've worked at the VA for 15 years, and for 11 of those years, I've been saying this thing was broken. But about 3 to 5 years ago, my boss's boss told me to shut up about it. Right? And so because we like kind of came in with these like President Obama capes, like everybody was like, sure, do you guys want to like open up this whole can of worms and like try to flip it upside down? And there were people that were like, it'll take you 2.5 years. Like we built the first one, which was like an Adobe PDF. It was not an online form. It was a PDF. And they were like, we built the first one. It took us 2.5 years. You'll never do it. Just stop, leave it alone. And we did it in 4.5 months because we are professionals. We knew what we were doing, you know, and we also tried to integrate some of those canaries in the coal mine, which are super important. That guy who was like, this thing's been broken for 11 years and I've been saying something. He was part of our team and our check-ins, but I'm saying that air cover is the thing that allowed us to even start messing with it in the first place.
And allows us to say, we're going to do user research.
Right.
Right, that part of working with us means that we have a playbook and we're going to use it. And so that doesn't have to be negotiated. So I would include that in the mix.
Yeah, but I think you've also, I mean, there are two things. One is that by finding a canary in the mine shaft, you found the person who actually probably knows all of the subject matter work that would take you so long to delve into, right? So rather than just saying, you know, the people sitting in that desk haven't done anything for 12 years, there's knowledge there. But the other is, I think, coming in and saying, we're just going to do it. I mean, starting with that attitude of, I'm going to make it happen. And the third thing is looking for sponsors, right? Looking for people who will back you. Finding ways to engage the people who are 2 or 3 steps up the ladder from you, because they give you air cover. I did a project at NCI where I was told my job was to make it happen in a year, even if I had to bulldoze the person who'd given me the project, right? And that gave me incredible air cover on a project that turned out kind of cool, turned into a thing called Accrual Net, which supports people who do recruiting for clinical trials. But I think every really great project has somebody who said, yes, this is going to happen, and then has let the people go do it. And so part of it is learning to take that authority when you're given it.
I do want to toss out, though, it's not, the air cover is vital to what our playbook was and getting anything done, but without the sort of lower level folk who were those canaries or who are actually doing the work, so like the GS-10s, GS-11s, in the DoD, it was often like the majors and lieutenant colonels who were like project managers or similar. If you don't get their buy-in, air cover doesn't do anything. You can try as much as you want, and they'll just go to ground and wait you out. And so I think one of the best case situations where I saw USDS, which was my experience, be effective is where we had that top level buy-in, and then also like didn't go in like, you know, maybe we would have our Obama capes stashed away because they were like wicked capes.
You wore jeans at the Pentagon. You had Obama capes.
Yeah. I hated wearing a hoodie. They were like, wear a hoodie, they'll know you're a nerd. And it's like, dude, I've been wanting to wear a suit for my whole fucking life. Anyway, that aside, when you go in, when you build those friends and like you actually acknowledge their experiences and don't wave that shit around, you will be in such a better position. Bulldozing people from the top is not great.
I also feel like air cover gets you so far, it can get you in the door, but if you're not proving your value and solving people's problems, then all you've done is get in the door and not really help. So I think it's really building relationships. So yes, I meet with the secretary of the VA and hear about all of his priorities, but then to actually do something with that, I have to work with all the people in the VA to do something with that.
How do you form a team to make that happen?
Well, I was super lucky to inherit an amazing team that I think, doubled in size. We really organize small, empowered teams on the work that we're doing. So we have, I think, 10 small teams right now working on a whole suite of veteran-facing tools, working on the appeals problem, and working on a cloud transformation for the agency.
So you've done things that you can deliver quickly or relatively quickly?
We've quick by government standards. I mean, you have no idea. Yeah, we deliver, I think, daily, if not weekly. But we really approach it very differently, and that creates tension within the IT organization, which is where we organizationally sit. I mean, they're really proud of their quarterly releases, and they're like, well, we're going to do that every 3 months. And we're releasing things every day and trying to work with them on things where it might be that two systems actually share data or need to work together. So we're trying to, as we are doing some of this work, also bring the agency along, thinking about modern development practices, thinking about DevOps, thinking about user-centered design. I was in a meeting with a lot of the IT leadership team, and they were talking about they don't have any research people. They have lots of business analysts and lots of requirement analysts, and I was like, I don't have any of those. But I have researchers and designers and product managers, and just trying to even think about the roles that you bring to these problems, and making sure that you're solving the right problem. And that's another tension point at the VA, is the historical model is that the business defines requirements and sends it over a wall to IT, and then IT builds it. And they're really not happy with us because they want to tell us the thing to do, and that's not how we get direction. So we're happy to hear their problem that they're trying to solve, and then we're going to do research and do some discovery to figure out the right way to approach that. And that's just a wildly different approach that, unless we are solving their problem, only gets us so far.
Yeah. Anyone else? Team strategies?
All right, so this is just from a different angle because I'm coming from a different perspective. So I'm a team lead for a creative team at HHS, and you mentioned trust, you know, we mentioned responsibility, and some of these other words that are up here on the wall. We try to bake things in from the start. And after, you know, I had this aha moment, coming back to take a look at how things were being done and how we can be more efficient up front. So that tied in a lot more of the, let's start with testing those wireframes, making those interactive and getting feedback. And I know that we did it, let's do it again, you know, and get feedback from that. And then, okay, now we're gonna work on style tiles, which are basically like, let's think about colors and let's think about concepts before we, you know, start diving in and doing things. Well, we're making sure that those are 5-way compliant, making sure that you have the contrast. If we're working with other elements like, say we're gonna incorporate sound, we're thinking about what's involved before things start to get coded, before we start involving more. We start to think about being inclusive and making sure that people can access everything. And this is just at the design stage. So this took some time in terms of thinking about the process so that we're not bolting things on at the end, how we're going back and changing them, and getting the team to also think bigger picture in terms of, okay, yes, I know we were asked to solve this. I understand we're going to be designing this portion of it, but what's beyond this, and where does it go, and who else is involved? And we understand all those portions. So it does become a yes and in the sense of, yes, here's the solution, and what about this, and this is what we're thinking, and what do we think, and let's take a look at the data, and let's take a look at what information we have that can help inform the design. So from a team perspective, we are trying to incorporate those things and bake them in.
Yeah, I think one of the proudest moments I had, we designed a voter guide template for California. They mail out reams of newsprint to San Francisco gets about 200 pages of voter guide. Our question was, is it worth the trees that died for this, that died for these? And we were really proud of that project. But what I'm really proud of is that as we started visiting some of the election offices, they would say, oh, and we're using the same template for our candidate information. We're using the same template for our poll worker training materials. Or they would send us something saying, well, I'm trying to extend this. Can you help it? Can you give us a quick critique? And so that meant that we were solving a problem that was real, but also helping them see solutions. They're not designers, right? If they have someone in the shop who can use Publisher, they're usually doing pretty well. But they nonetheless create things every day that people have to use. They create notices and forms and letters and things on the fly, and they do social media. And how do you help them, give them a base of things from which they can continue to branch out, continue to build their skills and build their capacity? Because as much as I would love to live with every one of the 58 counties in California, that's not going to happen. So I was also wondering, are there things that as you've matured into your vision of yourself as a civic designer, into the work that you're doing, are there things that have changed for you about how you think about your practice? Like I think about languages, right? That just came along for the territory in the kind of work I'm doing. And, you know, I'd gotten to diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, and I'd gotten to diversity in people with disabilities, but I hadn't gotten to languages yet. And that's opening up a whole new world of challenges for how to run sessions, right? It now takes, you know, I've gone back to things taking more time, and it's really hard to do quick, easy things. So we spend a lot of time planning something so we can do the same quick, easy testing we've always wanted to do. Anything else for you guys?
One thing that comes to mind is actually business models. So part of this is coming from IDEO, where like business design and business model design is like a really big thing. Like you don't do a project without doing business model work. And as I've done government stuff and now in the nonprofit world, there's not really business model design in the way that I've seen it in the private sector. And so one of the things that as I'm sort of evolving along this path, I'd like to actually identify more business models that nonprofits can pursue in order to get recurring revenue, in order to support their programs, in order to support their constituents, and not just rely on like trickle grant funding or be at the whims of government programs to support those kind of different service delivery. But also like within government, you can be innovative about your business model for a government program. And that's one of the ways that you can pitch or justify doing something if it pays for itself longer term. But you need to be creative about how that's actually going to happen. And I think we maybe don't think, like as a discipline of civic designers, we probably don't think about it as critically as we should be. Go ahead. So there's lots of ways. It's effectively like you're looking at the value proposition, you're looking at your customers, but you're also looking at how you are actually creating revenue, what your costs are, what the viability of the marketplace you're putting the thing into is, and how you might adjust the product or program in order to respond to that. The challenge is like in some cases there is a market. In other cases, there's just a need, but there's no actual revenue. So a lot of at-risk communities, for example, like you're not going to make any money there. And there's like people receiving the services probably aren't going to be able to pay for those services, but they still need to get them. And so that's the situation where grant funding is really important, or finding like adjacent business models that can support that core service delivery becomes really significant. But I think we are inclined towards designing products that don't have business models, and the products are like, they're great, they're user-centered, they're something that's needed. They are not going to survive because you can't pay people to continue to support them because there's no money coming in.
Yeah, as someone who runs a nonprofit now, the question we get asked by funders and we have a mixed model of funding and project funding, is what's the impact? So impact becomes currency in some cases but in the government, the are things they have to do, right? They're legislatively required to do things. And one of the things that we've used as a business model is kind of how can we make the time and resources that you devote to this worth more, right? Can you actually show that a voter guide that answers the questions voters actually have in an easy to find way, does that reduce the load on your internal staff, on your call center staff in the run up to election? When you're introducing a new, California's introducing a same-day, an equivalent of same-day registration, but being California, they call it conditional voter registration. So we now not only have to introduce this new feature, but we have to figure out ways to talk about it so that they don't spend more time explaining it than they do actually getting people registered to vote and voting, right? So that becomes a justification for doing the work up front, because if you can spend a day in your lobby doing some quick usability testing on the people from the public coming through your doors, then maybe you save yourself a whole pile of paper that you just printed that wasn't worth the work you put into it.
I was just going to say, I think that the business model is a really interesting kind of flip that really is kind of critical in civic design, because there is no revenue typically. Like, the government is not going to sell more appeals. But when you think about, like, there are,
you can have appeals.
yeah, seriously, buy an appeal. There are ways to measure impact, and what I've seen that's been really frustrating to me in a lot of the engagements that I've worked on, and I've worked at lots of agencies that aren't the VA, is their money is being spent with no tie to an outcome. So it's just money is being spent because we have money, because we have a program, because we have an idea, and we're going to spend money. And then we never say, did that $10 million get us the thing or get us closer to the thing that ties to our mission that we are trying to accomplish? Did the money that we're going to spend on deploying this new appeals legislation actually reduce the number of appeals or the time that it takes to process an appeal? I don't know. Maybe we should do some testing around that. But the return on investment, I think, is something that, because the government just seems to have endless buckets of money, they don't pay as much attention to. And I think as I think about that $4.2 billion, I would love to see that money focused on things where we're going to get the value of it, and not focused on things that we're just spending money because we have it.
So before we run out of time and we all go to the bar, I thought I would give you guys in the audience a chance to think about the question of how this relates to your work. And are there things that you can think of doing, or are there questions you have for us? Are there things you'd like to share with everybody about how this might affect your work? Maybe you work in something that's slightly different than the stories we've told.
How do you get around the language with legal department? There are a lot of forms like at FDA. We have forms right now. When I first joined, I looked at the form at first screen and I said, I'm out. I'm not going to use it. And I did a quick study on my own, and nobody could pass the first tab. But a lot of language was dictated by the legal department. So how do you get around to that? To change the form, like registration form you did.
I'm sure you have some thoughts on this as well, but I mean, the legal department wants their form to be used. So plain language, typically, if you need to have the legalese, you can include that as an addendum, but they want the form to be understood. So working with the legal department and showing them the data, maybe they're the stakeholder that needs to understand what is not clear to people. I don't think they're intentionally trying to build things that people abandon, or intentionally building things that don't make sense. They're just writing from their own perspective, which is not the perspective of the people using the thing.
And I would add that one thing that we've done a little bit, USDS in general, is try to design mobile first anyway, but when you design it in a mobile tiny frame and then put that in front of people, like the length of it becomes so much more painfully obvious. Like if the legal department wants a giant disclaimer on the bottom of every page, but that's half of the screen, you show it to them in that format and it's like, oh shit, don't do that. Right. So that's one of the ways you can kind of get them to dislodge their thinking on it and get them to trim it up a bit.
I'm really proud of the word the address where you live, parenthesis, residence. 3 states so far and counting. Right, but so sometimes it's synonyming, right, either introducing the word and explaining it, but there's also doing the research to know whether people actually know that word or not. I was really worried about a form that included decline to state on it, and they had yes, no, and decline to state. And it turned out that the people in this audience actually kind of got the difference. Talked it through. We actually put them in pairs to force them to sort of work through how they were going to answer the form, and it turned out that decline wasn't such a bad problem. There were some other kind of seemingly simple English words that were huge problems. So knowing what the problem is and what the impact of the problem is an important one.
I also have a little bit of a, I don't know what the right word for this is, a little technique that I've used with past stakeholders where imagine a Venn diagram where it's short, true, and meaningful. You can't have all three. Right. And so the true part of that is like the exhaustive truth, which is I think what the legal department always wants. But when it's exhaustively truthful, you are more often not, you're going to sacrifice short and meaningful. So you're going to get all of the truth in there, but it's not going to be usable and it's not going to be friendly. And it's what's the point, right? So being able to kind of say like where you want it to be lands out here on the Venn diagram. We need to get it closer to the middle where we're trying to achieve sort of all three of those things.
And I like that because you're acknowledging that they all three exist. You're not saying you're wrong because counsel's job may be to make it defensible.
There are trade-offs. There are always trade-offs. You usually can't have all three if it's a complex thing, so figuring out which one you're going to sacrifice.
I was
just going to say, and you brought up a really interesting point where it's, hey, show it to them on a mobile view. Because quite often everything looks great. You can kind of fit everything in. It doesn't look bad. And then, oh, by the way, I'm still on question 1. I don't see anything else under there. So, that's something that we're faced with that we usually say, you know what, let's put it in and show them and see how useful it really is.
I would also toss out a sneaky way of circumventing or getting folk on your team for this is to actually try to find a lawyer in the organization that you're embedded with and have them join your team. Make them native, and then use them as a weapon to get shit done. We did that at the DoD. We would have been murdered by everybody if we did not have our counsel who it went from being like, who the hell are these guys, to like pushing open source like nobody's business. So yeah.
And you can probably replace lawyer with doctor, any subject matter expert. I mean, it's essentially the same problem. They have fought their way through to the complexity of the issue, but they haven't come over the top of that mountain into the simplicity valley. Anyone else? Thoughts about?
So I have a question for USDS. I'm a government employee, and I'm thrilled that you guys were invented. I love that you have Obama capes. And you're solving the problems that we've not been able to solve. What happens when you go? What happens to the culture? Because that is my concern. And I'm saying I want that for everyone in government. Like, we shouldn't have somebody that's been like, for 15 years, I've been trying to tell them that, and they told me to shut up, And so do you all see when you solve these problems and you move on, will the culture change or will it go back to the way it was?
Great question.
So I will speak as somebody who used to be at USDS, right? Well, yeah. So I used to be at USDS. One of the things that we really tried to do on the team at the VA is, especially with that canary in the coal mine, is one, we tried to lift them up so that they felt like they had a voice moving forward, even when we kind of disappeared. We wanted to validate their assumptions, their feelings, and also really uplift them in front of their peers and their superiors, right? To kind of make sure that the next time they have something to say, people will at least maybe think about what they had to say. The other thing is, and I'm not sure how this is like transpired over time, but one of the things that we try to think about is like, how do these projects live on? So instead of just building them and then the USDS is like responsible for maintaining them for eternity, how do we bring in other parts of the agency so that they're bought in and then the maintenance goes on and the culture kind of goes on with that? And so there was like education, and I think education happened in a lot of different places. There was education around how GitHub was working, to like, how are you able to deploy every hour? That feels problematic. To like, how are you running tests? To what's the difference between sex and gender, right? Like, I mean, we had lots of different cultural education that I think still maintains with some of the people in the agencies. But then also as a person who has left USDS, I think I've taken this experience to the outside world and tried to continue to implement it from the outside, right? So I think a significant number of people who have left are doing that work, right? Whether it's at nonprofits, whether they went back to their state or local government and tried to do this. So I think the idea is that we try to make things better than they were. We try to leave the campground cleaner than it was when we got there, but then also we're like deploying ourselves to these other places so that the culture is coming up through the local state to the federal instead of having to do this like top-down thing.
Yeah, I think Code for America has been dealing with the same thing in their first cycles. You know, every year they pick 18, 15, some number of cities to do a project. And in the first cycles, those projects would get done, and 6 months later, they were carcasses, right, sitting there. And so they've been facing the same problem on a sort of short, on a kind of smaller cycle with how do you leave that city able to continue to do those things? Whether that's form their own digital service and make that part of the city culture, or whether it's just make sure that the guys who are going to have to maintain that piece of code actually know how the code was built. And all that. The other thing I think that really helps is that when stuff is built well, you can get metrics out of it. So you can get those impact statements. I mean, the number of times we've sat in front of an agency and said, so how are we going to track things? And they're like, well, we don't collect that data that way. And it's like, well, then how do you know whether the field office in this city is doing better than the field office in that city, or whatever that is? And so I think there's building in, if you start from knowing what you're trying to achieve, if you're able to expand what you're looking at, then you build it in a way that you can get at that code, you can get at the data, then things start to happen that live on.
I have one also very quick thing to add on top of this. At least my experience at USDS, like we were very much consultants. Like we did build some product, but like we were coming in as consultants, and the work that we did will never replace the good work that like, you know, GS folk and feds, like full-time feds, are doing, because we come in for a short time, we bring a particular expertise and experience that is not necessarily like any better or greater than yours. We're just coming at it from a different lens with a different kind of, frankly, air cover in this case. So I don't, like USDS, the work that we did could not happen without like all of the other work that is going on in government. We just seem to get the most press. Sorry. But well, thank you for your work.
Well, and thank you for stealing my question, which was how do we make this sustainable? How do we make this something that lives on and isn't just one of those projects that appears, stays for a few years and disappears? I mean, I think it's wonderful that we have this interesting mix. We have people within the feds as contractors, people who've stayed within the Fed as feds, people who've spun out and are doing other things outside, and I'm not in the feds at all anymore, so there you go. But because I think that it's really about a government ecosystem, because, you know, people in federal government come from somewhere too, right? So they came from a city, they came from someplace. And if we have this stuff modeled at a lot of different levels, then it's not quite as strange anymore. It is now 5 o'clock. We have 3 minutes, so I think we have time for one more question, because I saw a hand go up.
So just a couple of things to say how the words relate to the work. I work for a government contractor, and I have one government agency that I work with. And the government contractor label gets sometimes some bad connotations around it. I don't see myself as being someone who's going to say, do you want cheese on that? I do on the responsibility and the roles and the trust. I take my client's interest as mine. My mission statement is their mission statement. My question is, you talked a little bit about innovation, and innovation and government sometimes don't seem to go together very well. So there are regulations, there are policies, there are things that you have to work around that are sometimes counter to innovation. And I think the one, since we work in forms, that is most apparent is PRA. So kind of what are some ways, some tactics to inject innovation to kind of not subvert the rules and regulations and policies we have to live by, but to somehow transform those so they can be more innovative?
Well, I know there's a hot button. Go for it.
Well, no, I just think PRA is like a thing that we all are intimately familiar with, so we feel your pain on that. We had a PRA guru, basically. Erie Meyer was our PRA guru. She ran workshops about PRA for us to actually know the actual rules around it. And honestly, I feel like that is probably the only advice that I have is it is probably worth your time to get intimately familiar with PRA. Take a week or something and do a really deep dive and understand what it's actually saying. One of the things I feel like we ran into was a lot of people telling us what the PRA said. They're like, oh, you can't do that because PRA, or oh, but the PRA says that you actually, and then once we actually got intimately familiar, we were like, oh, that's not actually what the PRA says.
And some of those people are PRA officers in your agencies
Right.
who misinterpret it. But when I don't get access. Right, but I do think that understanding what PRA allows and requires additional documentation for gives you the tools to be able to make a logical argument and say, actually, the way this is written, we need to do these steps, but we can still do research. And I think there have been some changes to PRA recently, and there's lots of talk about policy changes in the future. But I came in with so many misperceptions about what I couldn't do, and have learned through Erie and through other people on the team about what actually is possible. But talking to users and doing user research is okay.
Yeah, when I started
is
talking
encouraged.
When I started talking to Erie and Dina and Dana, I was really surprised because I've been working at NCI and we had to go through IRB, which solved the whole problem. We actually got to do tons of research all the time because we went through this even weirdly more strict thing, and so extracting PRA out of that was quite easy. However, every usability test, every bit of research we did was divided into tranches of 9. Right? So we figured out a way to write all of our studies in groups of 9 so that we could do that. And then one year they actually let us do a longitudinal study where we're going to have 9 groups of 9 across the year.
I was just going to add that our PRA expert is in the room. Raise your hand. If you have questions, go ask Melissa. She's going to kill me, but
I think
buy her a drink.
World IA Day, I think IA group, I think this is a topic for a session. A whole evening probably. Well, I see people at the back of the room waving their hands at me. Paperwork Reduction Act. It's the Paperwork Reduction Act. It is a law that was designed with the good intention of ensuring that government did not overburden citizens. And it has been ossified, is that a good? It's just been sort of crystallized into an inflexible thing that says if you do a usability test with people, somehow that's burden. But if you look at any government form at the bottom, there'll be something that says what they think the burden of that form is. So,
if you don't know what it is, just count your blessings.
yeah, right. That's right.
And read it.
If someone says, we can't do testing in this agency, challenge them on it. Just challenge them. It's probably the most important thing you can do is find ways to let them get out. We've done a lot of work around the voting work because we don't do usability testing, we do fact-finding.
We didn't have it at the DOD. It was great.
There you go. Well, thank you so much. I am aware we're between you and the bar.